The mystery of the missing manuscript. A Miss Marple investigation. The village of St. Mary Mead, nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside, was the very picture of serenity. The streets, lined with quaint cottages and well-maintained gardens, stretched languidly between gently sloping fields and tall, leafy trees. Time seemed to move slower here, each hour slipping seamlessly into the next, as though the village were suspended in a quiet moment that never ended. The people who lived here, too, were creatures of habit. Life, for them, was a series of well-known, comfortable routines. Miss Marple, a slight woman with the keenest of eyes and the sharpest of minds, was as much a part of this landscape as the old stone walls and the ivy that crept up the manor house. She had lived in St. Mary Mead for years, and over the course of her life, she had come to understand the village and its people in a way that no one else could. There were few secrets in this small community, but those that existed were known to Miss Marple. Secrets that could be found not in the places where people hid their valuables, but in the spaces between their words, the pauses in their sentences, the way their eyes darted away when something uncomfortable was mentioned. Today was no different from any other, at least at first. The sun shone brightly on Miss Marple's modest cottage, the flowers in her garden blooming in their usual spots. Inside, she sat by the window, her fingers gently folded in her lap as she peered out at the world beyond. Her small cottage, with its soft floral curtains and mismatched furniture, was a place of peace and reflection. It was her sanctuary, her retreat from the world of noise and haste. But even here, in her quiet home, she could feel the faint stirrings of change. The village had come alive with an energy that was rare for a place so accustomed to routine. Dr. Thomas Brindle, a retired doctor with a peculiar passion for writing, was hosting a garden party at the manor house. It was an event to celebrate the publication of his latest manuscript, a project he had poured years of work into, and the small crowd gathered at the manor was filled with the usual faces, villagers who had long since stopped being strangers to one another, who could tell you about each other's habits, families, and innermost secrets. Miss Marple had not been invited to the party, nor had she intended to go. The event was not for her. She preferred the company of her own thoughts. Besides, she had little interest in the lives of the villagers, beyond what they could reveal to her without meaning to. People were, in Miss Marple's view, like books. No matter how carefully they were bound, the pages always turned themselves, and their stories unfolded whether they were ready or not. She had long ago learned how to read those pages. But even in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the buzz of activity outside. The village was alive with the excitement of the occasion. She could hear the soft clinking of teacups from the manor, punctuated by bursts of laughter and animated chatter. The party, for all its outward charm, was the kind of event that would have Miss Marple watching from a distance, not participating, but always aware. Then came the sound that would pull her attention fully away from the window and toward the events unfolding in the village. A sharp, piercing scream split the air. The noise, unmistakably feminine and filled with an edge of panic, seemed to freeze the world for a moment. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. It was a sound that didn't belong in St. Mary Mead, certainly not at a party celebrating a man's literary success. She rose slowly from her chair, her movements deliberate and unhurried. As she approached the door, she heard the thudding of feet racing down the path outside, followed by the frantic voice of Mrs. Henderson, the librarian. "Dr. Brindle, Dr. Brindle, come quickly. It's gone. It's disappeared." The words, spoken in such a frantic tone, set off an immediate ripple of curiosity in Miss Marple. She stepped outside into the warm afternoon air, her thoughts already beginning to weave a path through the usual patterns of village life, searching for the hidden threads that had been disturbed by this sudden, alarming event. The village was already beginning to stir. Mrs. Henderson's cry had been enough to disrupt the gathering at the manor. The guests who, moments ago, had been so consumed by their tea and polite conversation, now moved in confused clusters, whispering to one another in hushed voices. They had heard the scream, too, and the murmur of speculation had already begun. It wasn't long before others joined in, their voices rising with each new theory, each new suggestion of what might have happened. The manuscript, Mrs. Henderson said. Mrs. Lowry, the school teacher, whispered to a group of nearby women, clutching her hat as though it might fly away in the wind. It's missing, the manuscript that Dr. Brindle has been working on for years, the one he was planning to send to a publisher in London. But how could it be? Mr. Abbott, the farmer, asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Dr. Brindle's far too meticulous to lose something like that. Surely it's just misplaced. But the doubt in his voice did little to quell the growing unease. The manuscript, the very object of Dr. Brindle's obsession for years, had vanished, and no one could explain how or why. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She knew Dr. Brindle well enough to understand that his obsession with his work was not merely about the words he wrote. It was about something deeper, a need to prove something, to others perhaps, but mostly to himself. She had observed him on several occasions at the local shop, his intense demeanor and the way he would speak about his manuscript as though it were his legacy. The idea that it had simply disappeared, that it could have been lost or misplaced, did not sit well with her. The constable, a well-meaning but often bumbling man, had arrived now, his bicycle skidding to a halt outside the manor. He was a young man, earnest but not overly perceptive, his methods more instinctual than based on logic. He took charge of the situation quickly, issuing orders for the villagers to return to the manor and allow the authorities to sort out the matter. But it was clear to Miss Marple that this was more than just a case of lost property. There was something more, something that lurked just beneath the surface of this village, waiting to be uncovered. As the villagers filed back into the manor, murmuring amongst themselves, Miss Marple stood still on the edge of the gathering. Her mind was already working, already beginning to see the threads that others would miss. This, she knew, was no accident, and she would find out why. The manor house, usually a picture of dignified tranquility, now felt like a hive of restless energy. The garden, once a place of calm and laughter, was now the stage for whispers, hurried footsteps, and anxious glances. The guests, who had once gathered in high spirits to celebrate Dr. Brindle's success, now seemed more like a crowd of suspects. They milled about, some fidgeting, others speaking in low tones, but all of them aware that something had shifted. Something had happened that could not easily be explained away. Inside the manor, the situation was no better. Dr. Brindle had retreated to the drawing room, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Henderson hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her eyes darting nervously to the door as though expecting the missing manuscript to appear at any moment. The constable, trying his best to assume an air of authority, was already questioning the few who remained, but it was clear that the answers were not forthcoming. Miss Marple, who had been standing just outside the door, slipped quietly into the room. Her presence was like a soft breeze, unnoticed by most, but perceptible to those who paid close attention. She did not move immediately to speak with the others. Instead, she took a moment to observe. She noted the tense posture of Dr. Brindle, his fingers gripping the edge of the armchair as though he were holding on to something far more fragile than the furniture. His eyes, though, told a different story. They were not wide with panic, as one might expect from a man who had just lost something of such importance. Instead, they were dull, as though the disappearance of the manuscript had merely confirmed something he had already known deep down. Dr. Brindle, Miss Marple said, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of quiet authority. She moved toward him, her footsteps steady, measured. It seems there's been some confusion. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, It was with an expression of mild surprise, as though he had forgotten for a moment that anyone else was in the room. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said slowly, as though the words were unfamiliar in his mouth. "Yes, confusion. That's one way of putting it." He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his face furrowing as he tried to make sense of it all. Mrs. Henderson stood by the door, her face pale, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and Dr. Brindle. It was clear that she too was waiting for something, anything that would explain the strange calm that had settled over her employer. "I've searched the entire house," she said in a hushed voice. "Every room, every drawer. It's gone. Just like that." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze shifting from Dr. Brindle to Mrs. Henderson. "And yet, here we are, still wondering how something like this could happen," she said, her tone gentle but pointed. "It is curious, isn't it?" "Curious?" Dr. Brindle echoed, his voice rising a little, though he quickly reined it in. "It's beyond curious. It's impossible." He shook his head as though he couldn't quite reconcile the words with the reality of the situation. Miss Marple took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Impossible, you say?" She let the question hang in the air for a moment, watching as Dr. Brindle shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "And yet here we are, a manuscript, years in the making, gone without a trace. How very strange." He looked at her now, really looked at her, his expression flickering with something close to frustration. "I don't need you to tell me it's strange," he snapped, then immediately regretted the tone. "Forgive me, Miss Marple. I'm not myself just now." Miss Marple offered him a small smile, the kind of smile that only she could manage, one that held both understanding and an unspoken challenge. "Of course, Dr. Brindle, it's only natural to be upset. But perhaps, in all the turmoil, we might overlook something important, something that might be right in front of us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and for a moment Dr. Brindle looked as though he might speak, perhaps to dismiss her, perhaps to argue, but instead he fell silent, his eyes flickering to the nearby fireplace, the faintest line of tension still marking his brow. Mrs. Henderson seemed eager to take over the conversation, to shift the focus from the tense silence. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Maybe it's not lost at all. Maybe someone took it." "Someone took it?" Miss Marple repeated, her voice calm. "How strange." She paused, allowing the room to settle into quiet. "Why would anyone take it, Mrs. Henderson? And who, might I ask, would have access to such a thing?" The librarian hesitated. "Well, the guests, of course. The only people in the house were the ones who came to the party. Someone must have—" "Yes, of course," Miss Marple interrupted, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Someone must have, but someone too, who knew just how much it meant to Dr. Brindle. Someone with a motive, and perhaps someone with a very particular understanding of Dr. Brindle himself." Dr. Brindle flinched at her words, his expression darkening. "You're not suggesting— That's absurd." "Am I?" Miss Marple asked gently. "You see, Dr. Brindle, the thing about people is that they often behave in ways we least expect. It's not the obvious that always reveals the truth." The constable, having overheard their exchange, stepped forward, though his face remained clouded with confusion. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice tentative. "Are you suggesting one of the guests is involved?" "Not involved, necessarily," Miss Marple said, her gaze now sweeping over the room as if she were inspecting a puzzle laid out before her. "But everyone here." She glanced at the constable, then back to the others. "Everyone here may have a piece of the answer, but finding it will require us to look a little more closely. Not at the manuscript, but at the people." There was a stillness that fell over the room then, as though everyone had momentarily forgotten to breathe. Even the constable seemed to shrink back, unsure of what exactly Miss Marple was implying. But Miss Marple, undeterred, allowed her words to settle, like stones cast into a pond, the ripples spreading slowly but steadily. The pieces, she knew, would fall into place. They always did. The manor house had grown quieter in the hours since Miss Marple's quiet but pointed observations had settled over the room. The air had thickened with an uneasy stillness, as though everyone was waiting for something, though none of them quite knew what it was. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grand, dust-laden hallway. In the drawing room, Dr. Brindle sat by the window, staring out at the garden that had once felt so full of promise, now tinged with the shadow of the unknown. He hadn't said much since Miss Marple's words. She had a way of leaving a person to their thoughts, allowing her gentle observations to linger in the air like a forgotten melody. He still didn't understand it. How could the manuscript have simply disappeared? He had gone over every inch of his study, every drawer and shelf. The manuscript wasn't just important to him. It was his life's work, something he'd toiled over for years. Its sudden absence was like a wound to him, a betrayal of his own efforts. And yet, Miss Marple's words had touched something in him, something he didn't want to acknowledge, something he had tried to ignore for too long. Dr. Brindle, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tentative but cutting through the thick silence. She had been standing in the doorway for some time, watching him from a distance, unsure of whether to approach or leave him in his thoughts. He didn't look at her immediately, but simply nodded, acknowledging her presence. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something had changed, not just with the disappearance of the manuscript, but with the way Miss Marple had spoken. It was as though she already knew something he didn't, something that he had overlooked. That unnerved him more than anything else. "Do you think Miss Marple suspects something?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice low, though the concern in it was clear. She had lived with Dr. Brindle for years and had seen him through both his successes and his failures, but this felt different. Dr. Brindle's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair as he looked out the window, his gaze distant. "I don't know," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "But she's right about one thing. We're looking at this the wrong way. This isn't about the manuscript itself. It never was." He stood up suddenly, the movement jerky, almost as though the action had caught him by surprise. The room seemed too small for the thoughts that were running through his mind. "I've been so focused on the obvious," he muttered, shaking his head as though trying to shake loose the thoughts that tangled his mind. "I couldn't see the truth right in front of me." Mrs. Henderson took a cautious step toward him. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking louder might break the fragile thread of calm that seemed to be holding him together. Dr. Brindle finally turned to face her, his eyes darkened with the weight of his realization. The manuscript's disappearance, it's not random. It's not some thief looking for a quick gain. No, this is deliberate. Someone here knows exactly what they're doing, and they're sending a message. A cold shiver ran down Mrs. Henderson's spine. She had never seen him like this, never heard such uncertainty in his voice. But before she could respond, the door creaked open, and Constable Phelps stepped into the room. His face was drawn, tired, and his normally confident manner had slipped, revealing the deep unease that had been growing in him ever since the missing manuscript was discovered. "We've spoken to everyone, Dr. Brindle," the constable said, his voice strained but steady. "But no one's seen anything out of the ordinary. No one knows a thing about the manuscript." "That's what they would say," Dr. Brindle replied sharply. His gaze flicked over to Miss Marple, who had been sitting in the far corner of the room, unnoticed by most. "But they don't know what we know, do they? They don't know the truth." Miss Marple's eyes met his, and for a moment the weight of their exchange hung in the air like a silent understanding. "The truth," she said quietly, her voice steady and unhurried, "is rarely found in the obvious, and it's rarely found in what people want us to see." Her words felt like a key turning in the lock of his mind. For the first time, he began to understand what she had meant earlier. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped toward the fireplace, his fingers grazing the mantel as he spoke again, but now with a calm, deliberate precision. "I've been a fool," he said, his voice more measured now, the tremor gone. "I thought I could protect my work, keep it hidden away from everyone, but I didn't see what was happening under my nose. This is more than just a missing manuscript. This is about something I've been hiding, something I've kept buried for too long." Mrs. Henderson's confusion was evident. "What are you talking about, Dr. Brindle?" He didn't answer her immediately, but instead turned to Miss Marple, his eyes searching her face as though looking for some kind of confirmation. Miss Marple simply nodded, as though she had already known the answer before he even spoke it. "You knew," he said, his voice a whisper now, heavy with the weight of his confession. "You knew all along. This isn't about a manuscript. This is about a secret I've carried for years, a secret that someone has uncovered, and now they're using it to get to me." The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as the gravity of his words settled over them. Miss Marple did not move, but her gaze never wavered from his. She had heard enough to understand what had been hidden for so long, and now it was no longer just a matter of finding a missing manuscript. It was a matter of understanding why someone would want to tear apart the carefully constructed life that Dr. Brindle had built. "You're not the only one hiding something," she said softly. "But secrets always come to the surface, don't they?" Dr. Brindle's expression hardened, but Miss Marple could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was the same uncertainty she had seen in the eyes of many others, those who thought they could keep their truths hidden, only to find that those truths always had a way of revealing themselves. As the silence stretched, Mrs. Henderson finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Do you think someone here who knows about that secret? Do you think they took the manuscript to get to you?" Dr. Brindle's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment he didn't answer. Then he nodded slowly, his eyes dark with the realization of what he had allowed to fester for so long. "I do," he said quietly, "and I fear we've already been too late in uncovering it." The next morning, the air around the manor felt thick with tension. The villagers, though no strangers to gossip, found themselves unusually quiet, as though an invisible weight had settled upon them. The gathering the day before had left its mark on everyone, but it was Dr. Brindle who appeared most changed. He had hardly slept through the night, his mind working relentlessly on the puzzle Miss Marple had so subtly laid before him. Each fragment of the conversation, each fleeting look, had begun to form a clearer picture, one that he was still too reluctant to fully grasp. He stood in his study now, his eyes scanning the room, looking for something, anything, that might give him the answer he so desperately sought. The manuscript, or whatever had become of it, was still missing. But it wasn't just the manuscript that was at the heart of his concern. It was the secret he had long buried, the one Miss Marple had so deftly alluded to, the one that had drawn all this attention to him, to his life, and now to the manor itself. He turned sharply as he heard a soft knock on the door. Miss Marple entered without waiting for a response, her presence so quiet that it was as though she had been standing in the room all along, just waiting for the right moment to make herself known. Her calm gaze swept over him, over the piles of papers and the carefully organized chaos of his study, but her eyes lingered only briefly before she spoke. "Dr. Brindle," she began, her tone as soft as it was direct, "I imagine you're still wondering what to do next." He didn't respond immediately, his hand resting on the edge of his desk, his knuckles white from the pressure. Instead, he simply nodded. The look in his eyes was one of exhaustion, as if every answer he had ever sought had only led him into deeper confusion. "You've been a man of control, Dr. Brindle," Miss Marple continued, her voice steady and unhurried. "You've lived your life with order, with method. But this situation, this has unraveled something deeper than you anticipated, hasn't it?" Her words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they were painfully accurate. Dr. Brindle's life had been a series of carefully laid plans, from his medical career to his late-blooming attempt at authorship. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that life, much like a manuscript, could never be perfectly bound. His mistake had been thinking that secrets, like the one that now threatened to expose him, could be neatly confined and forgotten. "I don't know what to do, Miss Marple," he said finally, his voice edged with frustration. "I've been trying to keep everything in place, but this mess, it's beyond me now." Miss Marple observed him for a moment before speaking again, her eyes soft but sharp. "You've been trying to control the narrative of your life, Dr. Brindle, but now the narrative is controlling you, and you cannot fix this by simply searching for a missing manuscript. You must first understand what that manuscript represents." He frowned, his brow furrowing. "What are you getting at?" "The manuscript," she said, her voice unwavering, "isn't just a collection of words, Dr. Brindle. It's a key to something far more personal. It's not just the loss of your work, but the unraveling of something that has been hidden for a long time." Dr. Brindle's face grew pale as he began to understand. His hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached for the glass of water on his desk, but his fingers faltered before making contact with the cool surface. He lowered his hand, realizing the truth in Miss Marple's words. "You think someone knows about it, don't you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple nodded gently, her gaze never leaving his. "I do. And someone is using that knowledge against you. The manuscript didn't disappear by accident, Dr. Brindle. It was taken, stolen, to expose what you've tried so hard to keep buried." He swallowed hard, his throat tightening as the weight of his own secrets bore down on him. "But who? Who could possibly know what's in it?" Miss Marple stepped closer to him, her eyes sharp with the intensity of 1,000 observations. "It's not a question of who, Dr. Brindle. It's a question of who stands to gain from your loss, who has the most to benefit from seeing your carefully constructed life fall apart." Dr. Brindle stared at her, his thoughts swirling like a tempest. He had spent so many years trying to outrun his past, trying to maintain control, trying to forget the choices he had made. But those choices had come back to haunt him. And now, Miss Marple's words were a mirror, forcing him to see the truth he had spent so long avoiding. He could feel the rush of panic rise in his chest, but he forced it down, focusing instead on Miss Marple's calm demeanor. "You think someone here, in this house, knows about my secret?" he asked, his voice tight. "I don't think it's a matter of knowing," she said, her voice cool and clear. "I think it's a matter of suspecting. The villagers, Dr. Brindle, they are all connected to you in some way, whether they realize it or not. Your actions, your choices, have left marks on each of them, and now someone is using those marks to turn the tide in their favor." Dr. Brindle felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He had been so focused on the manuscript, so consumed by the idea that it was simply a piece of work to be stolen or misplaced. But now, Miss Marple was telling him that the manuscript was not just a thing. It was the thing, the key to everything. And someone close to him, was using it to unravel his life. He took a slow, steady breath. "So what now?" Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly, though her eyes remained focused. "Now, Dr. Brindle, we begin the search, not for the manuscript, but for the one who took it. For the one who has been pulling the strings, because they've made their move, and they will not stop until they've exposed you for everything you've worked so hard to hide." The weight of her words hung in the air like a cloud, and for a moment the manor felt even quieter than before. Dr. Brindle's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who could be behind this, no idea who had learned his secret. But Miss Marple's calm certainty was unsettling because she knew something he didn't, something he had been blind to for far too long. And now there was no turning back. The morning passed in a fog of uncertainty. The house, though grand and filled with the echoes of better days, now seemed shrunken, its rooms too small to hold the weight of the secrets they contained. Dr. Brindle could not shake the image of Miss Marple's calm, calculating gaze, nor the weight of her words. It was not the manuscript itself that had vanished. It was the fragile order he had spent a lifetime cultivating, now being unraveled by forces he could barely comprehend. Each time he tried to focus, to make sense of it all, his thoughts became a tangle of half-formed connections and unsolved mysteries. Who could have taken it? Who could have known? The morning was fading into afternoon before he found himself walking through the house, his steps slow and deliberate, each room more suffocating than the last. The grand staircase, once so proud and imposing, now felt like a prison to him. Every footfall echoed off the walls, reverberating with the realization that something had shifted in the very heart of his life. A small part of him still clung to the hope that the manuscript might somehow turn up, that it might be found in some forgotten corner of the manor, but that hope grew thinner with every passing hour. As he wandered into the study, his gaze instinctively flicked toward the shelves where the dust had settled thick on the edges of the books. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the absence of the one thing that had meant more to him than any of these tomes. The manuscript that had consumed his every waking thought for years. His fingers brushed over the spines, and he stopped momentarily at a volume of medical journals that he had not opened in years. He wondered if they had ever truly been his passion, or if they were simply another way to keep his mind occupied, to distract himself from the more uncomfortable realities of his existence. Then, the soft click of the door behind him made him turn. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, her hands wringing together nervously as she looked at him, her face pale and drawn. She had not spoken much since the incident, but her presence in the room felt heavier now, as though she too was bearing the weight of something unspoken. "Dr. Brindle," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been thinking." He glanced at her, the lines of fatigue evident on his face. "I'm not sure there's much to think about now, Mrs. Henderson. The manuscript is gone, and with it I feel as though I've lost more than just a piece of work. I've lost everything." She took a small step forward, her gaze flickering toward the window as though seeking some comfort from the view outside. "It's not just the manuscript, is it, sir? It's the secret, isn't it? The one that everyone's been whispering about." The words hit him harder than he had expected. He had hoped to keep that part of himself hidden, to bury it so deep that it would never rise to the surface. But Mrs. Henderson, in her quiet way, had seen through the cracks. She had always been observant, more so than he had realized. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself against the rush of emotions that threatened to overtake him. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough, as though it had been worn down by years of silence. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's the secret, the one I've kept locked away, and now it's out in the open, exposed for everyone to see." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the worry in her eyes. "I don't know how you've kept it all these years, sir," she said gently. "But I think someone knows more than they're letting on. Someone here in the house is playing a game, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." He turned to face her, his brow furrowed as he searched her face for any hint of the truth she might be hinting at. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice hardening with a mixture of frustration and desperation. Who could possibly know anything about it? The only people here are those who came to the party, the guests, and none of them could have known what was in the manuscript, let alone what it meant. Mrs. Henderson shook her head, her eyes filled with an unease that made Dr. Brindle's heart race. "You're wrong, sir. I think they know more than you think. I think someone is playing a much deeper game than we understand." His mind reeled as the implications of her words sank in. For a long moment he said nothing, the weight of the silence between them feeling suffocating. Mrs. Henderson's anxiety was palpable, but it wasn't just concern for him that colored her expression. It was something else, something deeper. Finally, Dr. Brindle broke the silence, his voice low but edged with urgency. "I need to know what you're thinking, Mrs. Henderson. If you know something, anything, tell me now." She glanced nervously toward the door, as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. "I've been watching the guests, sir. I know them all, you see. I've worked here for years. But one of them seemed off. A man named Robert Davis. He's been visiting here for some time now, under the pretense of discussing your manuscript. But I've seen him talking to some of the others in hushed tones. He's been asking questions about things that seem unrelated. Questions about you, about your past. And I can't help but think he knows more than he's letting on." Dr. Brindle stiffened. The name was unfamiliar, but the unease in Mrs. Henderson's voice was unmistakable. Robert Davis. He had never heard of him before, but now he couldn't shake the suspicion that this man might have been playing his own game all along, gathering information, digging into the past Dr. Brindle had fought so hard to bury. "I've seen the way he looks at you, sir," Mrs. Henderson added, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like he knows something you don't want him to know." The words were like a dagger, and Dr. Brindle's mind spun as he tried to piece together the fragments of his life that had been twisted by someone's unseen hand. He had no idea what Robert Davis wanted or how deep the man's involvement ran, but one thing was certain: the game had changed. It wasn't just about finding the manuscript anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, about who was pulling the strings and why. Dr. Brindle could feel the walls of the manor pressing in around him, the air thick with suspicion and the weight of secrets long buried. Every step he took seemed to echo in the empty hallways, each footfall a reminder that the truth was slipping farther away from him. The mention of Robert Davis, a name that had never even crossed his mind, stirred something deep within him. A sense of unease, an instinct that perhaps this man had known more about his life than he should. But how? And why? He walked the corridors, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with every passing moment. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in his mind, her cautionary tone still ringing in his ears. "He's been asking questions about your past." What was Davis hoping to find? What was it about Dr. Brindle's life that had attracted this stranger's attention? The study, which had once felt like a sanctuary of order and control, now felt like a tomb, a silent prison filled with the ghosts of things better left forgotten. He had locked away his past long ago, buried it under layers of work, routine, and the quiet facade of a man who had it all together. But now, with each passing moment, it felt as if that carefully constructed life was unraveling, and there was no longer any way to keep the truth hidden. He paused by the window, looking out at the sprawling garden below. The sight of the neatly trimmed hedges and the rows of flowers, all in their proper places, should have brought him some semblance of comfort. But instead, it only reminded him of the dissonance between the world outside and the chaos brewing within. The village, once a peaceful refuge, now seemed like a stage for a drama he hadn't asked to be a part of. He turned away from the window, the sense of impending revelation heavy in the air. He needed answers, and he needed them quickly. The longer he let this mystery fester, the more it would eat away at him. Robert Davis was no longer just a passing curiosity. He was the key to unraveling everything, to exposing the truth that Dr. Brindle had worked so hard to bury. The creak of a door brought his attention back to the hallway. Mrs. Henderson stood there, her hands wringing together, her face pale with worry. She looked like a woman caught between duty and fear, as though the very act of speaking was a betrayal of something deeper. "I've been thinking, Dr. Brindle," she said softly, her voice trembling with a quiet urgency. "I've never mentioned it before, but there's something strange about Robert Davis. He's not like the others who come here to discuss your work. He doesn't fit in with the rest of the crowd. He's always been so Secretive. Dr. Brindle glanced at her, the lines of his face hardening. What do you mean by secretive? Mrs. Henderson hesitated for a moment, as though carefully choosing her words. He never talks about himself. He asks questions about your medical practice, your time abroad, about your family. But he never shares anything about his own life. It's as though he's hiding something. A chill ran through Dr. Brindle, and he found himself drawn into her words, the unease in her voice mirroring his own growing suspicions. Who was this man? Why had he come into his life now, at this moment, when everything seemed on the verge of collapse? I don't know what his game is, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice faltering slightly. But I don't trust him. There's something about him that doesn't sit right with me. And now, with the manuscript gone, I'm afraid he might be behind it. Dr. Brindle's mind raced. He had spent years trying to keep his past locked away, hidden from the world, but now it felt as if the walls were closing in on him. Robert Davis had shown up uninvited, had started asking questions that touched on the very heart of his secrets. And now, the manuscript was missing. It was too much of a coincidence to ignore. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they formed a picture he wasn't sure he was ready to see. He clenched his fists, a knot of frustration tightening in his chest. I need to confront him, he said, his voice low and tight with determination. I need to know what he knows. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. Dr. Brindle, you can't. If he knows about your past, about the things you've tried to keep hidden. Her voice trailed off, and she took a cautious step closer. It could ruin you. It could ruin everything you've worked for. I have no choice now, Dr. Brindle said, his tone firm. The manuscript is gone. My secret is out. And if I don't find out what Robert Davis is after, then it will only get worse. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fears. Mrs. Henderson didn't speak again, but her gaze lingered on Dr. Brindle, a mixture of concern and resignation in her eyes. She knew, as he did, that once the past was brought to light, there was no turning back. Dr. Brindle nodded, his resolve hardening like iron. The decision had been made. He would confront Robert Davis, no matter the consequences. The time for running, for hiding, was over. With a final glance toward Mrs. Henderson, he turned and made his way toward the door. The corridors felt longer now, the walls closing in around him, but there was no turning back. He had to face whatever lay ahead. He had to face Robert Davis. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the moment pressed down on him. His heart pounded in his chest, but his steps remained steady. He knew that the next confrontation would decide everything. Whether it was the truth or the lies that had kept him hidden, it was time for it all to come to light. And as he moved toward the drawing room, he felt a cold certainty settle within him. Nothing, not even the secrets of his past, would stop him from learning the truth. Not anymore. The drawing room was bathed in a dull afternoon light that seemed to hang in the air like a mist, casting long shadows across the room. The furniture, once meticulously arranged, now felt out of place, too still, too polished. Dr. Brindle walked into the room with a sense of purpose, though his heart raced with every step. He had never been one to confront people directly, preferring instead to keep his affairs in order, under his own control. But now, everything was slipping from his grasp, and there was no more hiding from the truth. He could feel Robert Davis's presence in the room before he even saw him. The man's shadow seemed to stretch across the walls, looming larger than life, as if it were already claiming the space for itself. Dr. Brindle took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then stepped fully into the room. Robert Davis stood by the fireplace, his back turned, staring into the flames. He was dressed in his usual dark suit, his posture rigid, almost as though he were preparing for something. His hair, slightly disheveled as always, was a stark contrast to the carefully composed expression on his face. He did not turn when Dr. Brindle entered, but the air in the room shifted as though the very walls knew something important was about to unfold. "Robert," Dr. Brindle said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet anger that he could no longer conceal. The man at the fireplace did not immediately respond, but Dr. Brindle could hear the faint rustle of fabric as Robert finally turned to face him. His expression was calm, too calm, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed him, a flicker of something, almost imperceptible, something guarded. "Dr. Brindle," Robert Davis replied, his voice smooth but distant, as though he had been expecting this moment. "I was wondering when you would come to see me." The tension in the room thickened with every word. Dr. Brindle's hands clenched at his sides, the muscles in his arms taut with frustration. He had come here with the intention of confronting this man, of forcing him to speak, but now that he was face to face with him, he found himself struggling to find the right words. Robert Davis had a way of making the simple feel complex, making the obvious seem like a puzzle. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this has gone far enough," Dr. Brindle said, his voice low but sharp. "You've been asking questions about my past, about things I've tried to forget, and now my manuscript is gone. Don't tell me that's just a coincidence." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Robert's lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped away from the fireplace, his movements deliberate, almost languid, as if he were enjoying the tension in the room. "Coincidence," Robert echoed, his voice light, as though the weight of the situation were not pressing down on him at all. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's simply the consequence of asking the wrong questions." He leaned casually against the mantel, his gaze fixed on Dr. Brindle, studying him like a specimen under a microscope. "You should know, Dr. Brindle, that some things can't stay buried forever. You of all people should understand that." Dr. Brindle's heart skipped a beat. The words hit too close to home, and for a moment he was struck by the realization that Robert Davis knew more than he had ever let on. The manuscript, his precious manuscript, hadn't just been stolen. It had been taken with purpose. Robert wasn't just after the manuscript itself. He was after something deeper, something that Dr. Brindle had kept hidden from the world. "How much do you know?" Dr. Brindle asked, his voice strained, the edge of desperation creeping in. Robert's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "I know enough," he said softly. "Enough to understand that your life, your work, is built on lies. You've constructed an entire narrative for yourself, haven't you, Dr. Brindle? One that keeps your secrets safely locked away, but secrets like yours, secrets of the heart, always find a way out. It's only a matter of time." The room seemed to close in around Dr. Brindle as Robert's words struck him like blows. For a moment, he was paralyzed, unable to speak, unable to move. The truth, his truth, was hanging in the air between them, and Robert was the one holding the key. "What do you want from me?" Dr. Brindle finally managed to ask, his voice thick with the weight of his own realization. Robert stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Dr. Brindle's. "What do I want?" "Oh, it's not so much what I want from you, Dr. Brindle. It's what you want from yourself." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've spent your entire life running from the past, hiding from what you've done, from the choices you've made. But now, the past is here, knocking at your door, and you have two choices. You can confront it, or you can let it destroy you." Dr. Brindle felt the blood drain from his face. He knew deep down that Robert was right. He had built his life on lies, on carefully constructed stories that allowed him to live without facing the consequences of his actions. But now, those lies were coming to light. There was no escaping the fallout. He took a step back, his mind spinning, but Robert was already one step ahead of him. "You'll find the manuscript soon enough," Robert said, his voice smooth, almost as if he were offering a consolation. "But when you do, you'll understand something far greater. you'll understand that it was never about the manuscript. It was about you. Dr. Brindle's chest tightened, and he fought to keep his composure. He knew that Robert Davis was playing a game, one that was far more dangerous than he had originally realized. And he was right. It had never been about the manuscript. It had been about the secret Dr. Brindle had tried so hard to keep hidden. The secret that Robert had known all along. With a final, cold smile, Robert turned and walked toward the door, leaving Dr. Brindle standing alone in the middle of the room. The weight of his words, the implications of the truth, hung in the air like a cloud, and for the first time, Dr. Brindle felt the full weight of the choices he had made. He had been running for so long, but now there was no more place to hide. Dr. Brindle stood in the middle of the drawing room, feeling as though the floor beneath him might give way at any moment. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive, hanging over him like the weight of an unspoken truth. Robert Davis's words echoed in, his mind, each one a reminder that the past, the secret he had so carefully hidden for years, was no longer something he could control. It was out in the open now, and there was no escaping it. He tried to focus, tried to pull himself together, but the house felt colder than it ever had. The walls, once a comfort, now seemed to mock him, closing in on him with every breath. The truth was relentless, and it was staring him in the face. For a long moment, he did nothing but stand there, his hands trembling at his sides, his thoughts scattered. He had spent so much of his life pretending to be someone he wasn't, to keep his secret buried deep inside. But now, that secret was no longer his to keep. Robert Davis had forced it into the light, and there was no telling what the consequences would be. Dr. Brindle turned away from the window, his gaze drifting across the room. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. He had simply wanted to escape, to outrun the mistakes of his past, to build a life that was free from the shadow of guilt. But in trying to outrun it, he had only brought it closer. Robert Davis was right. His life had been a series of carefully constructed lies, and now they were crumbling before him. He couldn't stay here, not like this. The manor, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt suffocating. It had become a tomb for his secrets, and he needed to get out, needed to breathe, to think. He grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and moved toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the empty room. The weight of the situation pressed on him, but he couldn't afford to remain stagnant. He had to do something. He had to find a way to take back control. As he stepped outside, the sharp winter air hit him, the cold biting at his skin. He pulled his coat tighter around him, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the chill in his chest. The village lay before him, the quiet streets stretching out like a labyrinth he had no intention of navigating. His feet moved instinctively, carrying him forward, away from the manor and away from the pressure that had been building ever since Robert Davis had arrived. His mind was a storm of thoughts, none of them clear, all of them urgent. What had Robert meant when he said it wasn't about the manuscript? What had he meant when he said that Dr. Brindle would understand something greater? Dr. Brindle had always believed that the manuscript, his years of work, was the thing that tied everything together, that held the key to his future. But now, in the wake of Robert's words, he wasn't so sure anymore. Was it really just about the manuscript? Or was there something more? He walked for what felt like hours, though in reality, it was only a few minutes. The village was empty, its cobbled streets deserted in the late afternoon light. He passed familiar buildings, their windows dark, the quiet of the village pressing in around him. And yet, despite the isolation, he felt strangely exposed. The secret he had worked so hard to bury was no longer just his own. It was a thing in the world now, something tangible that others could hold and turn over, examine. And he couldn't shake the feeling that someone else, someone more calculating than he had ever been, had been